Everyone, for your capstone project, you're going to write what's called a literature review. And in this video, I'll explain some of the main characteristics of a literature review and how I've gone about writing them in the past. I'll talk a little bit about and provide you examples of literature reviews that I've read and that I've written. And I'll also make available to you some sample literature reviews that previous students have written. But let's talk first about what a literature review is. It's an overview of a scholarly conversation about a particular topic. I study assessment and teaching writing, and so I'm really interested in making sure that I'm on top of those conversations, that I know what the scholarly conversation is about those two topics. So I keep my eyes open for new discussions in the discipline, things that I may not be on my radar. One topic that I've been interested in recently is something called directed self-placement. That means that when students come to college, they get to choose what writing class that they go into, whether it's a developmental writing class or English 1101 or 1102 or something like that. That's something I don't know a ton about, but as luck would have it, other scholars have thought about it and written what's called a literature review to kind of summarize the conversation around directed self-placement. Here's a literature review written a few years ago about directed self-placement. It includes, later on in the document, annotated bibliography entries. Annotated bibliographies are short descriptions and reactions to specific articles. You will not need to write these for your capstone project, but they can be really helpful as you conduct your own research. The literature review portion at the beginning of the document provides a useful overview of the scholarship. It talks about 3 different trends the researchers identified in the research: Trend 1, Trend 2, and then Trend 3. Within those paragraphs, there are citations that we can follow up on if we want to learn more. In all, the literature review and the annotated bibliography is a really helpful document that helps other researchers understand what the scholarly conversation is around a particular topic. In your capstone project, the literature review will be used in the same way, but it will also help show how your project is situated in that scholarly conversation. A few years ago, when I directed the writing program here at Shawnee State, I wrote a book chapter about big data and how it might be applied to writing program administration. The book chapter was more or less a large literature review. I read a bunch of articles about big data and how it might apply to writing programs and to higher education. I identified trends among those articles, and those trends became sections of the book chapter that I wrote. Now that makes it sound all kind of easy, so let me slow things down a bit and kind of go into a bit of detail about how I went about writing a literature review on that topic. I began by finding some research on the topic. Now I assume that most of you, because you're seniors and you're further along in your studies, that you know how to find research on your topics, but I would just give you kind of 2 recommendations based on the years that I've spent teaching this class. One, definitely use as a starting point scholarship and articles that you've read in the department, especially if you're following up on a topic that you've discussed in other classes. Use that reading list as a starting point. It makes sense to do that. The second thing I would recommend is to use the library's databases. The library spends a lot of money to maintain those databases and to have access to those databases. And some of you are working on topics that aren't necessarily in English studies. They're probably better addressed by disciplines like sociology, psychology, or education studies. And we have databases that are dedicated just to those disciplines. There's one that's just for psychology, or one that's just, we actually have a few that are for education and a few that are for sociology. Use those databases. They can really help you out. If you'd like to know more about how to do that, I'd be happy to work with you on that. Once you found some articles, then you read and take notes. I read a lot of abstracts, so that paragraph at the beginning of an article that kind of summarizes what the article is about, I read that. And if I like what I see in the abstract, I'll read a bit more, particularly in the findings section or the discussion section of an article. I take notes on what I've learned, how that information might be used in different contexts. I might read the article's other sections if I think that there's something really interesting going on in them, like maybe they're using really unique methods, or maybe they're going to talk a little bit about the different populations that they worked with to conduct their study. Once I've read a few articles, I'll start to develop some commonalities. Maybe look at the frequency with which something is mentioned, some topic or subtopic is mentioned. I keep reading until I find a lot of repetition in the article. and I take notes. I take a lot of notes when I read, and let me show you a little bit about the notes that I took for the big data article that I was just talking about. Here's the research journal that I used when I wrote that article or that book chapter on big data research and how it can be applied to writing programs. So I read a bunch of articles. All these entries here, that's an individual article that I read. So you see here, I kind of just brief summary, my reaction, and then I have specific places in the article that I thought were really interesting. You definitely do not need to take this approach. This is a little type A kind of approach to a research journal, but having some kind of system in place can be really helpful when you need to put together trends for a literature review. So I took a lot of notes, and so tons of notes about that one article because it was a really important one. There's others that I did less note-taking on. And then what I did after that is I went through, and where I saw commonalities, I would highlight in a particular color. So this yellow here, with this yellow here, there might be other articles where I've highlighted things in yellow. Then I'm kind of bringing those commonalities together. Those commonalities, or those areas where I have the same highlighting, those are the sections of my literature review. All that stuff that I highlighted in yellow, we're going to make that a section of the literature review. If there are articles that are significantly different, but they're still talking about the same topics, sometimes I'll include them as a point of contrast. If there's a lot of folks that are disagreeing about a particular issue, that might be a separate section of my literature review. Let me show you what this all kind of means in that book chapter that I was talking to you about big data in writing programs. So here's the book chapter that I wrote about big data in writing program assessment. Let me show you a little bit about what I'm talking about in terms of identifying trends. So I have an introduction that kind of explains what these major trends are. I started off with a short anecdote, which makes sense for writing a larger book chapter that is a literature review. Probably wouldn't work for the literature review you all are going to end up writing for your capstone project. But here's one section, defining big data. So everything that I highlighted where I noted that people were just trying to define what big data meant, that was all kind of grouped together, and it became this section of my literature review. Later on, I have opportunities of big data analytics. So here in this discussion about the opportunities of big data, I organized information based on where scholars saw benefits in enrolling students, and making sure students graduate, and making sure students complete their classes. I started wide, so I started with taking a look at universities as a whole, not actually universities, so I actually started with nonprofit organizations, and then I went to universities as a whole, like higher education as a whole, and then I got down even further into classrooms and how people were talking about big data in classroom applications. In the literature review you write, you'll want some kind of organization structure. Each paragraph of your literature review should cite several articles and should have a connection to the other articles in the paragraph. So it's important to have some kind of reason why you're going from one idea to another in your literature review. That can be very helpful for readers. For me, it was starting wide. What have people said outside higher education? Then what are people saying inside higher education? What are people saying about big data as it applies to specific classrooms? The point behind a literature review, behind most literature reviews, is to help readers out and to help them understand a topic that they might just be getting familiar with. So they don't know much about a topic, they read a literature review to kind of get up to speed about what other folks have said about it. In your capstone project, the literature review shows the reader that you've done your homework and that you're not asking a research question that somebody has already answered. The first paragraph of your literature review might give an overview of the trends that you identified in your research. What were some of the major findings after you've done that research about that phenomenon? What were some of the major trends? What are your paragraphs going to be about, more or less, in the literature review? In the final paragraph of a literature review, you have to do this kind of tricky thing where you transition from that scholarly conversation to your own project and to your own research question. So you're kind of identifying, like, other folks have said this, but here's my research question that might be related to that, but that conversation missed something that I'm going to address in my own project. That transition can be a little tricky, but if you pull it off, it makes for a really kind of smooth movement between that and the next section of your project, which will probably be the methods section. That can be a little tricky. but it's going to be very helpful for your reader to understand how the pieces are kind of put together. Like everything else with this class, if this is new to you, if you have not done this before, I'm here to help. So let me know if you're having trouble either finding sources or kind of making sense of the trends that you've identified in the literature review, or maybe even how to identify trends in the literature review. I'm here to help, so take advantage of that. I'll talk to you all soon, and that's it for now.